So let me introduce our panel today. The topic of the panel is MiCA, which is a topic that most of you are very familiar with, I can assume. It's the crypto assets framework at the EU level. It kept us all busy the last 3 years. It's still in the process of getting the level 2 done. One of the reasons why we have Elisabeth Noble here from the EBA. Secondly, there is a lot of follow-up and implementation that needs to be done, and that's something the member states need to do and the institutions in the member states, and that's why we have Chamberod here from the MBB. And last but not least, the industry has an opinion about that as well, obviously, and they need to deal with it. And for that reason, and also because of her background, she was the head of the blockchain center of the OECD before, so she knows her way around, is Caroline Malcolm, who will take up today the role as our industry speaker. And just to jump into the debate, right? The most important things now that MiCA is adopted, and I want to start with you, Anne, if that's fine, is like, how do you, as an institution, prepare yourself for MiCA, and what do you see as the biggest challenges in this process?
Does that work? I don't think it does.
Can you check the micro, please? Can you maybe see?
Oh. Yeah, it does? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. As you know, there are many supervisory responsibilities deriving from the MiCA regulations. In some member states, there has already been official assignment of MiCA competences to some authorities, and in some other member states, discussions are still ongoing. That's the case in Belgium. This being said, what we do observe in those countries where there has already been official assignment of responsibility is that generally the split of competences is made between the Financial Market Authority and the Prudential Supervisor. And in Belgium, both the National Bank and the Financial Market Authority have had the opportunity to participate to MiCA negotiations, which means that both authorities are already familiar with the text. Generally speaking, when NCAs need to prepare to implementation of new legislation, there are two ways, the theoretical way and the practical way. Theoretical aspect, I guess, is even more important for MiCA because we do not only have new regulation, but we also have new underlying technology NCAs may not be familiar with. For the technical preparations, I guess, one of the most important way for NCAs is to participate to group discussions, expert group, and I'm looking at Elisabeth because one of the most important is the group discussion organized by the EBA and headed by Elisabeth, which is an opportunity for NCA to gain expertise, but also to exchange views in order to reach harmonized position on certain aspects. For the practical preparation, some NCAs, like the NBB, do have the opportunity to already touch upon MiCA through the exercise of their own competences. If a bank wishes to start crypto assets activities, it will need to comply with banking regulation, which means most of the time notifying the banking supervisor and getting authorized by the banking supervisors. So if a bank wishes to start issuing EMTs, it will need to comply with the banking law, with probably current e-money legislation, but the regulator will also ask the entity to anticipate MiCA and to take MiCA into account. There would be no sense in authorizing the issuance of a crypto asset that would be prohibited under MiCA. And that's a very good way to already analyze in detail and try to find concrete application of the theoretical text.
Thanks for that. If you look at this from the EBA perspective, Elisabeth, is this something on what you have to do with all the level 2 implementation prep? Is this something that worries you, makes you excited? Or how would you describe the process that the EBA is undergoing? Because it sounds very challenging, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have underway a number of different preparatory actions. Of course, the first one to progress with the progression of the level 2 mandates. And we are at this moment concluding the consultation phase on the first batch of our mandates, which relate to authorizations and complaints handling. But this autumn, you can expect to see another 3 batches of consultation paper published. So mid-October, we should be publishing those mandates related to governance and suitability of members of the management body, of issuers of ARTs. Then our 3rd batch, which should come out towards the end of October or early November, should be on the subject of the prudential mandates, such as own funds and liquidity. And then the very final batch coming out towards the end of November. So this is a challenge for us because of the number of mandates. It's also a challenge for our member authorities because the need to ensure the coherence between the mandates and also between our mandates and ESMA's mandates, which I think Julianne and others will talk about later today. But that's only one of 3 challenges that we have. The other 2 relate to, of course, preparation for our own supervision function and to prepare for our other tasks under MiCA. On the supervision function, as you'll be aware, the EBA is responsible for supervising issuers of significant asset reference tokens and significant e-money tokens. And we have to be ready for that responsibility from mid next year. So concretely, we're working towards building our supervision team, building our supervisory policies, procedures, the sort of mechanics that we need to have in place between national level and EU level to ease the smoothness of that transition from one layer of supervision to another. But it is a challenge because as yet, we have a very immature market for ARTs and EMTs. So it's almost a case of learning as one goes. But then the 3rd role is one that Anne referred to earlier, which is a really key one on convergence of classification. So we have these in MiCA relating to ARTs and EMTs. But these are definitions that actually are not so easy to apply when you actually look at the diversity of tokens on the market. So something we have to do. Thank you. Perfect. Something we have to do is work very hard with our member authorities and also with the industry to promote that convergence in classification and practice so that we don't end up with a situation where in one member state, a competent authority may determine a token to be just other crypto, and in another, they may determine it to be an asset reference token. So we really want to push the dialogue early on around the application of the definitions in MiCA so that we have consistency in classification from day one of the application of the new regime, which is why discussions with both the industry and supervisors are just so important.
Thanks for that. Could you maybe elaborate a bit how, as an industry participant, you can join these conversations? Because there's ways to do that, right?
Yeah, several ways. So, of course, for all of our level 2 policy mandates, we have consultation procedures. So for our first batch of consultations on authorizations and complaints handling, I think the deadline is the 12th of October for consultation responses. And of course, for all of our mandates, we have public hearings as well. But through the network on crypto assets and through some of our other structures, we have regular opportunities for industry to come and present to us, our staff, and of course, our member authorities, different types of token or use case. And we're very, very keen to hear from you if you have a new proposition that you would like to share with the authorities to promote discussion and to promote understanding of opportunities and risks. So our sort of key request is reach out to us because we don't always know who you are, but hopefully by now you know who we are. So just call us and there'll be some sort of opportunity where we'd be happy to hear from you and of course hear your comments and concerns or reflections on how the MiCA implementation process is going in practice.
Thanks for that. I think it's a very important point, right? Because often there's the feeling that there's a faceless institution that is bombarding you with regulation and technicalities that you're hard to see through as somebody that is not a regulatory or policy expert, right? And I think to get this understanding on that there's a structure in place that you can follow through and there's people that actually mean good for everybody involved, I think that's super important. Based on that, when you look at this from the industry perspective, Caroline, what is the market looking for now that MiCA has been adopted? How do you think it will play out?
I think one of the things that we're looking at sort of across the EU member states, and both Anne and Elisabeth have touched on this a little bit. I might have to borrow that microphone. Thank you. That you've both touched on a little bit, and it probably also though goes beyond just sort of questions of harmonizing the approach to questions around classification, is that wanting to make sure that we don't end up with a system where, you know, ostensibly you have one system, the MiCA regime, but in practice you have 27 different systems. And I think although, you know, some people might think of that, well, there might be opportunities for arbitrage there because you'll have different approaches taken across different countries. But realistically, for businesses that are looking to operate across the EU, and that's really where the business case is to be made, not in any one particular country, but in access to the whole market. And if you're going to have those different approaches, and we know, of course, there are provisions in MiCA that allow, you know, if one particular competent authority isn't happy with the approach being taken, they can raise complaints, they can limit the ability of that business to operate in that market. So ultimately, like, it is in the industry's best interest that there is this coherent approach across the EU market to how MiCA actually gets implemented. Because I think, and this I think is not unique to MiCA, but when you have a bunch of countries are trying to apply one single standard, this question of you can write the same words down, but how they're actually interpreted and applied in practice in terms of everything from, you know, the actual onboarding process when I make my application, what questions are asked, where's the emphasis put, where are they really looking for that further information, through to the ongoing sort of monitoring and supervision that occurs, really looking for a more consistent approach. And I think that's something that the industry is very conscious to look at as we start to move into the implementation phase. Because the reality is, even though MiCA itself, you know, was only adopted relatively recently, the provisions at that sort of top layer of legislation have been pretty consistent. You know, although there were some sort of final tinkerings in that last 6 months or even in the last year, the reality is that we were all pretty clear for quite a long time now what was coming. So hopefully at that top level, there's not a lot of surprise. But as we get into the detail, things are really starting to sort of shake out in terms of what do some of those different questions mean in practice, and then that kind of next stage, which is implementation.
Just as you've been traveling around the world talking to regulators, how was MiCA perceived outside of Europe, right? Because in Europe, we're very proud of MiCA because it's the first of its kind, large-scale framework for crypto assets and beyond. But how did other jurisdictions look at it in your perspective?
Yeah, and look, I think Europe should be very proud of what they've achieved with MiCA. And, you know, that's also from the industry perspective, people can complain about bits and pieces, but this is the most comprehensive piece of legislation. And to really take this industry to the next level and really allow it to open up, you need something like MiCA, and you need that certainty that the regulation brings. And so I think, you know, a huge amount of work went into it from all different parts of the ecosystem. And I think we should be very happy ultimately with what's been achieved there. I think the way it's seen across the world, there's a couple of different, you know, I think when we think about how different countries are approaching the question of regulation, sort of really kind of two schools that we're seeing develop. Either you have countries looking to adapt their existing, often financial regulation to, you know, incorporate digital assets into that. And that's a little bit more, for example, what we're seeing in the UK, for example, or we have regimes like a standalone regime like we have with MiCA, where you have a whole new regime, perhaps based upon what we've seen in another sector, but really trying to create a new framework. And I think the way that, you know, MiCA is looked upon is in that regard is perhaps not necessarily a benchmark, particularly for countries who are going to perhaps go in a slightly different direction, but it's certainly a comparison point. So everyone's looking, well, what am I choosing to do in comparison to MiCA, and how is that going to position me in the market? And I think that's something, which is very interesting to watch. And we're also seeing, and I'm excited to see what happens in terms of adoption and how the market responds once MiCA actually comes into place. Because something that we see, if we look, for example, over at the UAE, which is often touted because it's sort of become a very dynamic place for this space. And what we've seen is that regulation has come into force is not just that the kind of what I'll call traditional crypto business has grown, but some of the more advanced parts of the markets, like the DeFi market, for example, has also really grown in that world as more people move into that geography and you start to see kind of the different parts of the ecosystem blossom. And I think that's also going to obviously bring into relief this question around the things that go beyond, the scope of MiCA as we saw it.
Thanks for that. I think that's very clear. Just from your perspective, you're both sitting in international fora, more or less. How do you perceive MiCA is being basically taken up by colleagues from other places than Europe? Are they like looking at it as like more of a role model, or is it something that they're rather take and say like, okay, we'll do it better, leaner, or even bigger? Or what's the general response that you get?
I mean, I think as Caroline says, it's very much a comparison point. So I think people are looking at the sort of gap-filling nature of crypto to think, okay, do we have a similar gap in our own jurisdictions? Or is there a similar need to create some sort of bespoke rules for certain types of activity? And if so, can we look at MiCA as a sort of template for that? And I think particularly on the crypto asset service provider side, we're seeing a lot of interest in the Title V provisions, safeguarding, segregation, governance requirements. Also, very interestingly, conflicts of interest management comes up a lot. Perhaps that's not surprising in light of the whole FTX debacle, but we see a lot of discussion and interest in how you manage conflicts of interest where the entity or group is carrying out lots of different crypto business lines. And I think that's something that we will see translated into some of our discussions as we look to set up supervisory colleges under MiCA, where at the EBA we're required to establish the college where we designate an ART or EMT issuer as significant. But the college function is not limited to just the issuer component. It allows us to bring lots of different competent authorities who are somehow involved with the ecosystem for that token in terms of distribution, custody, etc., around the same table. And I think those college arrangements will also be very useful as a way to ensure joined up supervision, but also really focus on some of these points around conflicts management and so on. But I think that's something where we will put a lot of attention, and again, where we're seeing quite a lot of interest around the international standard setter table.
Thanks for that. And looking at this, as we just discussed, from an interinstitutional perspective, right? The MBB is part of the central bank system in Europe. How is the engagement going on with the EU level on this? And what's the role of the MBB in this process, for example, with the ECB? What do you see the role there? And do you see any challenges that you still have to overcome, or that you generally see in the process, right? Because it's all, as we heard, about implementation and preparedness. And it's a very techie topic, so, right? And I think a lot of the issues, or rather the concerns, I think the industry has, is that they're misunderstood in the process, right? How does, for example, a central bank or a regulator, more generally maybe, prepare for that also in the network that it operates in?
Okay. Well, so far, if we're talking about MiCA preparation, we've received a lot of help and assistance from the ECB and also from the EBA. I think the international regulator, European regulator, are a nice forum for regulators to try to reach harmonization, to gain expertise, as I said, but also to reach harmonization. Elisabeth touched upon the difficult classification of tokens. are the practical questions that we do receive and where the EBA is very helpful, but the ECB also, is the sometimes difficult interactions between MiCA regime and the already existing regime applicable to financial institutions. If we take banks and as an example, the ECB has provided some very useful guidance on to how apply banking regulation to crypto activities, and on the other way around, we have a lot of very useful discussion both with the EBA and the ECB onto how to apply MiCA regulation to banks when there are some overlaps. The recitals of MiCA is quite helpful in saying that when you do have an overlap between CRD and MiCA, you need to apply the most strictest or the more specific rules, regulation. But that's mainly some arbitrage. And as Caroline say, there is a need to avoid those types of arbitrage, hence the necessity to have the possibility to discuss those topics. Another type of topics that do regularly come or issue raised by the sector so far is the difficult application of PSD2 to the ecosystem. And that's a question that refers most precisely to EMT that do qualify as e-money and so as PSD funds. We do have a lot of questions as to do I need to apply for a MiCA license or for a PSD license if I provide custody services for EMT only? Do I need to apply ACA, strong customer authentication, to EMT accounts? What is a payment instrument in a crypto ecosystem? These are the types of questions that are key for the sector, but also for the regulator. And it's a very good opportunity that is given by the EBA or by the ECB to discuss those types of issues to get harmonization.
Is it too early to ask your view on the PSR? Or maybe it's for next year?
Yeah, it's probably for next year. I think PSR has quite a long way to go in the co-legislative process. We know measures can change from time to time, but Anna's absolutely right to note that there is a cohesion question and a serious cohesion question when we look at crypto transfers and what they are in practice and whether or not PSD is engaged, whether it's PSD2, PSD3, etc. And so when we're looking at transfer services for crypto, we will need to have some serious discussions to provide, I think, some guidance around interpretation of the provisions and which segments of legislation are engaged, because none of these pieces of legislation exist in isolation. So you need to look very carefully at the range of services offered to then be able to give a sort of consistent steer to the industry about what the expectations are for compliance.
Just an optimistic additions. I think it's nice that those questions arise now because we're still in a preparatory stage, and I'm rather optimistic that most of the issues will be solved before those provisions are entering into force.
I don't know if you want to comment on that.
No, not in particular. Although one of the things that came to mind as I was listening to Elisabeth and Anne speak is also the differences we're seeing just at the level of sort of the transition process to MiCA. We've got some countries which are moving very quickly to align their domestic legislation so that transition process both can happen more smoothly but also more quickly. And you have others who have almost from a strategic perspective taken the approach, it seems, that they'll wait as long as possible until just before the entry into force date to actually kind of align their domestic legislation. And even that, this almost race to, attract the business in, get them domiciled there, but also to, I think it's that process, and it kind of reflects the very steep learning curve that national competent authorities are having to go on to actually understand what is required. And the reality is there's very different levels of resourcing available in different countries to actually be able to make that transition. So I think it's probably a few different factors which kind of explain the different approaches, but from the industry perspective, those sorts of things can really inform where you go to seek that license. And once you've made that decision, except for a few countries, a few companies who are applying, in many jurisdictions, most will not have that sort of luxury and will just be looking to identify one. And those are some of the factors. Is there a regulator there who can kind of walk as a partner with them through that process? Or is it going to be a very sort of, this is the way the rules work, even though we all appreciate that the rules are still very much kind of in process of development in terms of the finer details. And so I think some of those things in terms of just the culture of how the competent authorities approach the industry, not just what's kind of written down in the rules, is also a factor from an industry perspective in how that process of making a choice of, which of the member states I go to for the license.
Okay, so we heard a lot about the upsides and the preparedness that is taking place. When you look at MiCA now, and it's quite a comprehensive piece, do you see any gaps there? Is there room for improvement? And I leave that for you to comment as well if you're there. I'm not sure if you're allowed to, but I think Caroline can now probably give you a lecture.
Well, I guess I'm not sure if gaps is the word, because I think there were just some very clear choices made about what it would cover and what it wouldn't cover. But I think at the same time, and something which surprised me even, is that if we look, and I guess DeFi is the kind of the obvious one. And I think that the conversation on DeFi at the international level between standard setting bodies has advanced a lot more quickly than perhaps we had expected back when MiCA was even just sort of a year ago. If you'd asked me a year ago, so when will we get to DeFi regulation? 27, 28. And that might still be true from an EU perspective, simply because of the, kind of the timelines and the sort of the politics involved with the need to bring new legislation forward. But in terms of what individual countries are going to do, we're seeing a much more rapid development of the thought processes and the theory of, what delineates DeFi from CeFi, what are the relevant factors to look at, what are the different approaches. I think something we haven't seen yet from the industry side, though, and this is where I sort of really encourage a lot more work, is this question around, given that the regulatory discussion on DeFi is progressing a lot more quickly than we all might have thought, there is a need to step up in terms of the reg tech necessary to bring the same policy objectives to the DeFi space as we have in CeFi. And I think there's firstly that reality, people coming to terms with the fact that that is sort of the writing on the wall. And secondly, thinking about if we don't, as an industry, want to be in a situation whereby the same rules get applied into DeFi as CeFi, then there is a heavy onus on industry to come up with practical solutions that will achieve the same policy objectives without looking the same way in terms of how what that road actually looks like. So I think that's probably one of the big ones. And then probably the other one is, of course, NFTs. And there, I think kind of the international discussion is a little slower. And I think what for me is most interesting from a policy perspective on NFTs is the way that we start to blur the lines between what we've traditionally considered a financial asset and what we consider data or an information asset. And I think NFTs are very much in that grey space. And then this question of, well, who has regulatory oversight of something which perhaps doesn't quite look like a financial asset, doesn't quite look like data? Where does it sit and who has responsibility for that? And I think that's going to be a very, very interesting discussion and goes far beyond the crypto digital asset space, because it does get into that world of kind of what I think of as data assets versus financial assets.
I don't know if you guys want to comment. If not.
Well, I think MiCA is perfect, so I will leave Caroline and Elisabeth develop that point. Just maybe to point that next to MiCA, I believe that there are other regulations that may be worth developing as well. And I'm thinking of civil law in particular, where there is no harmonization yet at an EU level. but I guess knowing how you need to classify a crypto asset in civil law is key to know which insolvency rules you need to apply in case of problems, to know how you can seize a crypto assets, which are unknown. I mean, in most, we do have answers, but there are a lot of legal uncertainty, and the answers are different from one country to the other.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't disagree with any of what Caroline and Anne have said. I think for now, though, the challenge really should be focused towards what we do with MiCA implementation itself. And here, I would really pick up on the point Caroline mentioned around monitoring capability data, both on the industry side and on the supervisory side, because something I am concerned about is the ability collectively to monitor the perimeter and to enforce the perimeter. And if you don't have good market surveillance, you're not going to be able to do that. So I think priority one really needs to be investing in the relevant data and tech solutions to ensure that we have the best possible capability to enforce what's already there. In terms of gaps, yes, true DeFi is outside the scope of MiCA, but we know that DeFi covers very many different manifestation of structure and product. And so for me, I'm a little bit less concerned about that at the moment because I don't see that many examples of structures or products that truly would fall outside of MiCA, whether under the CAS provisions or somehow under the issuer provisions. And then, of course, we've got the issue of interpretation. So who is an offerer, who is an issuer, etc. And there we will be looking at these terms with a high degree of scrutiny when we see the emerging business models and see through an interpretation lens what else can be achieved through the legislation that we already have. But for sure, legislation needs to be revised from time to time, and we already have a mandate by the end of next year to provide some advice to the Commission on certain elements around DeFi, on staking and lending, and also on NFTs, so that perimeter is always under review.
Maybe to ask a follow-up question, because Caroline just mentioned it. There's a number of assets that potentially could be hybrid, right? How would a regulator or supervisor look at those? What is your perspective on this? Is there something that as an industry participant you should take into consideration when creating those, or is this something that is still in discussion?
It's a really interesting point, and actually it goes to a set of guidelines, in fact, the only joint ESA guidelines under MiCA that we have to produce by the end of next year on the classification of crypto assets. And that actually requires us to produce a so-called standardized test for crypto asset classification. And I think with that test, of course, we can't supplant the definitions that are already in MiCA, but we can provide a bit of structure to guide the thought process around classification. So what do you need to do first? Well, clearly you need to consider, is the token a financial instrument or a tokenized deposit first? If it is, of course, as we know, it's covered by MiFID or CRD, CRR, respectively. Then, if you're not in the realm of this other legislation, then you are in the realm potentially of MiCA. And of course, you have to then apply that sort of process of, is it EMT, is it ART, is it something else, is it excluded? This all sounds rather straightforward, but again, we know that these definitions are not necessarily fully straightforward to apply in practice. So working closely with our partners at ESMA and EIOPA, we will be preparing some guidelines next year, and Julianne may also want to say a couple of words about this on a later panel. But we will be trying to provide as much clarity as we can to help inform industry explanatory memoranda and opinions that have to support the white papers and really assert the classification of the token in question. And of course, that's something then that can be reviewed by national authorities. And we also at the ESA level have the option and capability to issue opinions on the classification of crypto as well. So that's really a way to, on a multi-pronged approach, support this convergence in classification.
Just as a follow-up, should we be worried about like a European Howey test now, or is this?
I don't think it's a question of being worried. I think it's a question of looking at this as an opportunity to get additional clarity on the definitions and on the structure for how you should approach classification decisions. Ultimately, they will always be case by case, and you have to look at the individual features of the token. But we do want to sort of promote a confidence in classification under MiCA. And so really important part of our level 2 and level 3 measures will be this set of guidelines that will help provide that sort of supplemental underpinning for how to approach classification under MiCA.
Do you want to add anything to that?
Well, not much, but again, I think we should all very welcome all the guidances that will be provided by EBA, because it needs to be seen as a kind of discussion and ongoing discussion, and that will be the result of all the discussion between the regulators. But as Caroline said, there is also discussion between the regulators and the sector, particularly in this preparatory phase, and these discussions are really helpful for both of us, and we are learning from each other. And that's the reason why we do encourage the sector to come up with their business model, with the new ideas, because we are really in a process of learning from each other.
Maybe just before you answer, because it seems that we need a lot of data for all of that, right? And good quality data. How can we make sure that we have that and that it ends up in the right hands as well, right? So that the decisions that need to be made are sane decisions, reasonable decisions, pro-innovation decisions, right? That also ensure consumer protection, financial stability, market integrity, right? That's like a Herculean effort, it sounds. Is there a way to achieve that? Or do we have that data?
Maybe just before I get to that question, I want to touch on the reference to the Howey test, because I think a really important distinction that we have here in Europe is that if we think about the US situation, you have this situation whereby, well, if you fall within the Howey test, it's very clear what you have to do. You're a security and you have to do these things. But what's not clear in the US is what happens if you fall outside. That's a massive advantage that we now have in Europe, in the sense that whether you're one or the other, you know the rules that you need to follow. And I think that's just such an important benefit from the industry perspective. And we're starting to see, coming back to data, this question of data, we're starting to see the impact of what happens when you don't have a regulatory regime in place. So we already know, for example, that bans, for example, don't work as a policy tool. And now we're starting to see through the data what happens when you don't have a regulatory regime in place. So you have what we referred to as regulation by enforcement, which is that it doesn't affect, and you might have seen Chainalysis just put out its global adoption index. The top 20 will have all countries out, top 154 countries in the next month. But even in that top 20, you still see the US there. And by the way, there is no European countries in the top 20. That was also true last year. They get in there at 21 last year. We have Germany coming into the phase. So it'll be interesting to see how MiCA changes that. But you still see, for example, in the US, a high level of adoption, but you see a shift away from US-based exchanges from the data. And so I think that's, and from a regulator perspective, that's a net loss, because you still have all the exposure in your market, but you lose the touch points and the ability to actually do something about it if you are looking at consumer protection issues or market stability issues. And so I think that's one of the things that MiCA is going to give this industry, both from a government, policy objective or societal policy objective approach, and from an industry approach. But now to come back to this question of sort of data around supervision and do we have the data? I think one of the challenges that is kind of a mentality change is about this desire to, number one, just take all the data. And as we know, having had quite a lot of experience in this on the tax side, is that, there's this desire to take all the data, but if you can't use it effectively, then it's actually not not very useful. So trying to be judicious about what is the relevant metrics that will help you make better supervisory decisions, I think is something which was still being worked out. But the other part of that is the difference this industry brings in terms of what you can get from on-chain data versus what needs to be reported to you. And then you have sort of all sorts of sort of third-party data that you might sort of take from various parts, or you scrape from parts of the internet and so forth. I think that shift between what is reported to you versus what you can just go out and get yourself, because it is available on chain through that transparency, is something which perhaps hasn't fully been understood. And we're only beginning to explore what that actually looks like, and to remove the temptation, well, I'll just make them reported as well. Okay, well, you don't actually have to, because it is already there for you to take, and it's valid, and, it's immutable, all those things that we love about blockchains. That data is really reliable. You can use it as a comparison point to check the information that is also being reported. But a lot of that information that might give you signals about things that are happening in the market that perhaps you should be concerned about doesn't need to come anymore from reported data. You can do it through market surveillance tools, looking at what's happening in terms of on-chain information.
I don't know if you guys want to comment on that, or if you have any different views. Good. As we're closely edging towards the end of our panel, I wanted to ask all of you, is like, when you look now at what we discussed, right? There's a lot of preparedness happening. Everybody's happy with MiCA. There are some gaps, but they're not big. So it seems like we're heading in a positive direction. If you now would recommend somebody that works in this industry and is not a regulatory expert, and has never engaged with an institution like the EBA or the MBB, and because they're a small startup and they're just starting now, and they know MiCA is coming, it will make their life easier. They can passport through Europe, which is a huge advantage of any European regulation, but in particular, I think in the finance space, where it saves you a lot of lawyers' cost, which, as you know, is always high. And what would you recommend them to look at, how to start and engage? And maybe like as a small guidance at the end to entrepreneurs, SMEs that want to make it right and use MiCA to their advantage so that they're fully compliant and basically can passport themselves. I don't know if anybody of you want to start.
Well, I would advise them to carefully read MiCA first, and then certainly that to do not hesitate to go and talk to the NCAs, because, as I said, there's an ongoing discussions. We're all aware that we're all in preparatory stage. And I guess the best way is to start talking to the regulators. And some regulators do provide some, not advice, but guidance on the directions to be taken. But I guess that MiCA is quite clear. There are some uncertainty, but I mean, most of it is quite clear. The framework is quite clear, and how you need to build your business. If you follow MiCA, I think it's easier than before, at least.
Yeah, and focusing specifically on the issuer side, I would encourage those who are interested in issuing ARTs and EMTs to already look at our websites, to look at our sort of MiCA feature. You will see there a transition phase statement for the next sort of 9 months or so until the ART, EMT provisions come into application. That transition phase statement highlights certain expectations that we have around preparatory steps, and they're really there to help encourage issuers who are potentially going to look for authorization under MiCA to already start adjusting their compliance systems and controls, essentially with a compliance by design mindset, so that when it comes to that authorization stage, the issuer is already very well placed to submit their application, to demonstrate their governance, to demonstrate their internal risk management systems, their approach to, of course, reserve management and so on, but fundamentally also really focus on getting disclosures to customers right. MiCA is pretty extensive on its face in terms of white paper requirements, etc. So we would really strongly encourage people to start early with looking towards that application date next year. And I would also just mention that we have a Q&A tool now active on the EBA's website for MiCA. So if you do have interpretative questions that you wish to raise regarding MiCA itself, then that tool is now active, and we will be working very closely with our ESMA colleagues and our Commission colleagues to try and respond to those interpretative questions as quickly as possible, again with a view to promoting convergence from day one.
Thank you. Mary-Caroline, last words on what you would recommend?
Yeah, I think, look, this question of engagement, one thing that, we have a business on the private sector side, which ranges from your traditional financial institutions through to your, fintechs, through to your crypto natives. One thing that always really shocks me when I speak to the sort of crypto native players is sort of asking them, well, when do you go and engage, particularly AML, which is where, most businesses are already regulated if they don't have more comprehensive regulation in place yet. And the only time they'll engage is during an actual supervisory exam. And this is completely different to what TradFi does, which is they are in there all the time in conversation with their supervisor and just building that relationship. The time to build a relationship is not when you're under an active examination. The time to build the relationship with the supervisor is well in advance. And I think that's something I really notice as a big difference. And I wonder often if it's cultural, if they're worried. Also, though, if they, having the bandwidth to engage, and I appreciate that that's a cost, but, it's one of those things which will pay off over the long term. But I think that's probably the thing is really to engage.
I think on that note, that's the perfect ending. I think it is important to engage. And, one of the reasons why we as Blockchain for Europe exist is because we wanted to make this work. And we want to have people understand and access points to that. And I want to thank you all for joining today. Maybe a round of applause for our speakers. And if you have any questions, I'm pretty sure they're happy to answer them bilaterally if you have any. Thank you.